Night-cloaked Kuala Lumpur International Airport as Malaysia Airlines Flight MH370 prepared for takeoff. The air buzzed with routine, but tension lingered unspoken. Richard said, "Every mystery begins with silence, and tonight silence would echo across oceans." Inside the cockpit, Captain Luang checked his instruments with a practiced calm, while First Officer Tan scanned the runway lights, their voices clipped and professional. Families hugged in the departure hall, their goodbyes unaware they were eternal. A soft rain tapped against the windows, as if nature itself whispered caution. The narration deepened. What vanished that night was more than a plane, it was certainty, replaced by endless shadows. The engines roared, bright against the black canvas of the night sky, carrying with them 239 souls into history's most haunting mystery. The voice continued. In those first few moments, everything seemed ordinary. But within hours, the world would be asking questions no one could answer. Questions that even now resist the light of truth. The night grew darker as MH370 vanished from ordinary radar. Richard said, "A routine flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing should have been unremarkable, but sometimes fate interrupts the expected." In the air traffic control tower, men watched glowing blips with quiet confidence, their voices calm. Yet as the blip marked MH370 drifted further, an unseen shadow was already unfolding. Outside, the rain had stopped, replaced by humid silence. The words echoed. The world would sleep soundly that night, unaware a story had just begun, a story that would haunt history. Families left the airport, their smiles fading into normalcy. None knew that the last sight of that plane was already behind them, fading into mystery. Hours passed before alarms rose. MH370 had not checked in as expected. Richard said in Aviation, "Silence is not peace. Silence is danger." Phones rang across centers in Kuala Lumpur and Vietnam, officials trading clipped words. On digital screens, timelines grew red with missed signals. A calm flight had become a vanishing act. The narration whispered. At first, disbelief reigned. Systems were rechecked, excuses made. But truth always arrives, slow and undeniable. For those watching, the absence grew heavier, pressing down like lead on their chests. Something terrible had begun, yet no one dared say it aloud. By morning, the silence had become unbearable. Richard said, "When a plane disappears, it is more than metal lost, it is lives suspended between earth and sky." Families gathered in waiting rooms, hope clinging like fragile glass. Some prayed, others clutched phones, waiting for updates that never came. The media arrived quickly, cameras flashing like lightning. Officials gave statements, their words hollow and unconvincing. The narration deepened. The truth was gone with the plane, and what remained was a chasm of unanswered questions. In the eyes of the waiting families, shadows of fear deepened into dread. As hours stretched into days, the search began. Ships and planes scoured the seas, but the sky yielded nothing. Richard said, "The ocean is a cruel keeper of secrets." Families clung to televisions, desperate for news, as images of waves filled the screens. Each day without answers was a wound left open. Officials urged patience, but grief demands immediacy. The words continued, "The longer a truth hides, the heavier its weight becomes." The world watched, but beneath the headlines, whispers of conspiracy stirred. The mystery of MH370 was only beginning. Dawn washed the city in dull tin as the news looped the same map and the same absence. Richard said, "If the official lines are straight, the truth hides in the margins." He replayed the midnight handovers, chasing pauses between syllables. Paper rustled like surf as he pinned arcs, timelines, and weather reports. He circled coordinates no one mentioned on television. Richard said, "Silence has fingerprints when you press long enough." The apartment hummed with laptops and a kettle that never boiled. Outside, traffic started, ordinary and cruel. He traced a path that bent where the world said it did not. Richard said, "If the transponder died, the story did not." He called a number he had avoided for a year. He needed a mind that could argue him back from cliffs. The call reached a lab where screens glowed like small moons. Eleanor answered with a careful calm that cut through static. Eleanor said, "Conjecture is cheap, Richard. Data is not." He swallowed the sting and sent files, inviting demolition. Fans whirred as spreadsheets opened like vault doors. Eleanor said, "You want rigor, not rescue." He agreed, because rescue had failed everyone. They set a rule to doubt each other before doubting the numbers. Richard said, "If we err loudly." She replied, "Then let the math shout first." The pact felt heavier than friendship and lighter than grief. Night reclaimed the windows while their cursor trails braided across the screen. They rebuilt the timeline from raw logs and sleepy voices. Eleanor said, "Hand over Nirigari." Then the transponder vanishes. Richard marked a kink that the public maps smoothed away. Eleanor said, "Primary radar hints a turn, but uncertainty blooms." He listed fuel, altitude, and climb rates like prayers. Eleanor said, "Assume competence in the cockpit until facts deny it." Richard winced at the word, then nodded. They modeled the reach of radio silence as a widening ring. Eleanor said, "Gaps are not proof, but they are not comfort." He stared at the ring until it felt like a noose. Outside, thunder rolled without rain. Inside, the room smelled of dust and resolve. Morning briefings delivered words that sounded like answers and behaved like smoke. An official smiled without warmth and repeated yesterday's script. Richard said, "They are managing panic, not truth." Cameras clicked like hail as the room rehearsed outrage. Eleanor said, "We cannot fight a podium, we fight the dataset." He stood back and watched phrases drift into headlines. A guard yawned at the door as if guarding nothing at all. Eleanor said, "Request raw ping logs, not summaries." He filed a terse letter that asked for numbers, not hope. Outside, the sky finally broke, and rain erased the chalk dust of the city. The reply was not a gift, but it leaked enough to matter. A spreadsheet crawled with timestamps that pulsed like a heartbeat. Eleanor said, "Satellite handshakes, sparse but stubborn." Richard traced distances into arcs bending toward open water. Eleanor said, "North is theater, south is grief." He felt the floor tilt, as if the sea had arrived early. Eleanor said, "Assumptions must be signed in blood, then tested." He whispered, "Thanks to no one," and circled the farthest arc. The apartment dimmed to a single island of light. Richard said, "If this path holds, everything else breaks." She answered, soft as thunder, "Then let it break." Whispers filled the corridors of power before they reached the streets. Richard said, "Facts are fragile things in the hands of those who prefer shadows." Eleanor leaned across the table, her eyes sharp. She said, "There's resistance, not from science but from politics." Richard tightened his jaw, sensing the invisible hand pushing back. Theories about hijacking, sabotage, and secrets took shape, each heavier than the last. Eleanor said, "If Mercer is involved, you're playing with someone who controls the narrative." Richard replied, "Then his silence is my map." The more official reports surfaced, the less sense they made. Behind every page was a hand that had edited the truth into something unrecognizable. Charles Mercer emerged, calm and commanding, dressed in control like a second skin. He spoke at conferences with polished certainty, offering explanations that evaporated under scrutiny. Richard said, "A man that's smooth has something to hide." Eleanor whispered, "He feeds the public certainty because truth would fracture them." Cameras adored Mercer's composure, while his smile disguised the weight of buried secrets. Richard felt the first edge of danger slice through his obsession. I'm fool. Every step forward seemed already anticipated, as if Mercer had drawn the path himself. Richard said, "He wants us to chase smoke while he keeps the fire hidden." Eleanor replied, "Then we study the smoke until it betrays the flame." Late night brought visitors who blended too easily with the dark. A man named Daniel Hayes offered information, his tone persuasive and casual. Richard said, "Allies appear when shadows grow long." Eleanor was wary, her voice low. She said, "He knows too much too soon." Daniel's charm was practiced, his words smooth, his smile carrying the weight of rehearsed trust. He leaned forward, offering coordinates, hinting at truths only insiders should know. Richard, hungry for answers, took the bait but felt the barbed hook beneath. The room grew colder, not from the weather but from the unease between them. Back in the lab, tension cracked between certainty and doubt. Eleanor said, "He pushes too quickly, Richard. Good data never arrives with a salesman's smile." Richard bristled, defending the fragments Daniel had shared. He said, "If we dismiss every source, we die waiting." Their voices sharpened, layered over the hum of machines. Eleanor's words carried weight. "Trust is currency, and you're bankrupt if you spend it here." Richard's reply was softer. "If truth costs betrayal, I'll pay." Their silence afterward was heavier than their argument. In that silence, the first crack in their partnership appeared. A fracture Daniel would widen with ease. Mercer's influence deepened, his speeches filling headlines while Richard and Eleanor fought shadows behind the curtain. Richard said, "The louder he speaks, the more deaf the world becomes." Eleanor answered, "Truth whispers, lies shout." Daniel's suggestions drove them deeper into classified corridors, where access required risk, and every step was betrayal waiting to be revealed. Richard's determination sharpened into obsession, cutting ties with caution. He whispered, "If Mercer holds the lock, I'll break the door." Eleanor's face showed fear, not for the truth, but for the man Richard was becoming. And still the night pulled them forward, deeper into conspiracy's grip. Storm clouds pressed over the ocean as Richard traced satellite paths across maps spread like wounds. He said, "The sea hides what the sky reveals." Eleanor leaned closer, pointing to pings that stretched southward. She said, "If this is real, it ends far from any beacon." Richard's pencil carved arcs into the void, his breath quickening with obsession. Eleanor warned, "This trail is danger disguised as data." He answered, "Danger is truth's shadow." Their eyes met across the paper, both knowing the path promised answers and ruin. Thunder shook the glass, as if the sky echoed their fear. The ocean waited with silence, ready to swallow them whole. The knock on the door came as a whisper against the storm. A woman entered, eyes shadowed with secrets, her presence uninvited yet undeniable. Lucia said, "You searched the wrong shore." Richard stiffened while Eleanor bristled. The stranger moved, like someone used to silence. Richard asked, "Who are you?" She replied, "A ghost of those who vanished." Her words carried truth without proof. Eleanor frowned, whispering, "Informants never come without a cost." Lucia said, "Cost is already paid, only collection remains." She slid a slip of paper across the table, coordinates scrawled like scars. The storm outside rose, as if to confirm her warning. Lucia's coordinates led to fragments buried in classified archives. Richard said, "Every secret weighs more when it's denied." Eleanor typed furiously, systems groaning under pressure. Lucia stood apart, silent but watchful. Richard muttered, "She knows what we fear to ask." Eleanor countered, "Or she knows how to bury us." Files unfolded like coffins, each line heavier than the last. Patterns emerged, deviations unmarked in public reports. Richard said, "Someone rewrote the sky itself." Eleanor's face hardened, Mercer's fingerprints. Silence followed, punctuated only by the clicking of keys. The weight of conspiracy thickened the room, until even the air seemed dangerous. Amid the noise, a quiet figure emerged, Amelia Foster, daughter of a missing passenger. Her voice trembled. "My father believed someone was watching the flights." Richard softened, for her pain pierced the data's coldness. Eleanor's gaze wavered, sympathy overtaking suspicion. Amelia whispered, "He wrote notes before the flight. I never understood them." She handed Richard a weathered notebook, edges frayed with grief. Richard said, "Sometimes truth hides in plain paper." Amelia's eyes filled. I just want to know where he rests. The notebook lay heavy more than grief, less than clarity. The mystery's weight shifted, personal and tragic. The notebook revealed codes written in margins, coordinates hidden in grief. Richard said, her tragedy is our compass. Eleanor whispered, or our undoing. Amelia sat quietly, her pain raw, unaware of the danger her father's notes carried. Lucia said, secrets have blood on them, and now yours is marked. Richard traced the lines, each number pointing deeper into the Southern Ocean. His voice hardened. If this is true, someone killed to keep it silent. Eleanor warned. And they'll kill again. Amelia's tears blurred her vision, her loss turning into fuel for the chase. The notebook closed with a sound like a verdict. The coordinates led to locked archives, guarded by silence and suspicion. Richard said, truth sleeps behind steel doors. Eleanor tapped the console, her frustration sharp. She said, Hayes promised access, but the files are veiled. Daniel arrived, his smile too quick, his words too smooth. He said, you want the truth? Then follow me. Richard hesitated, drawn to the bait. Eleanor's warning cut through, he gives paths too easily. Richard muttered, easy roads rarely led to light. Yet his obsession pushed him forward, blind to the hook in Hayes's charm. The first betrayal had already begun, cloaked in the guise of friendship. Richard followed Hayes through corridors where whispers turned into echoes. He said, secrets hide in the dark, but so do liars. Hayes smirked, leading him to restricted access terminals. Eleanor's voice was tight. This isn't a gift, it's a trap. Hayes whispered, every truth demands a toll. Richard, blinded by the lure of answers, logged in. Files spilled across the screen, scattered with contradictions. Eleanor said, half-truths are poison. Richard's hand trembled as he realized Hayes's data led in circles. He said, he fed us smoke. Eleanor whispered, and we breathed it in willingly. Their trust cracked, the fracture widening. The trap snapped shut when Mercer's men appeared, suits pressed, expressions blank. Richard whispered, so Hayes was the lure. Eleanor's heart sank as armed guards sealed the exits. Mercer's shadow loomed larger than his absence. Hayes said softly, some truths stay buried for good reason. Richard hissed, and some betrayals are written in blood. Eleanor grabbed Richard's arm, pulling him back from reckless words. She said, survival is truth enough tonight. They slipped through service tunnels, breath ragged, as Mercer's voice echoed in memory. The game had changed. Betrayal was no longer rumor, it was survival's price. At a safe house, Eleanor confronted Richard, anger cutting through exhaustion. She said, you trusted the wrong face, and now we bleed for it. Richard whispered, betrayal teaches sharper lessons than loyalty. He slammed his fist against the desk, maps scattering like broken promises. Eleanor's voice softened, you're chasing ghosts at the cost of the living. Richard said the dead demand answers too. In the corner, Amelia trembled, realizing her father's memory had become weaponized. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, you fight over truth while we drown in loss. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Betrayal spread wider when Emily stepped from the shadows, her voice carrying old familiarity. She said, you should have stopped, Richard. His blood ran cold, his sister now an enemy. Eleanor stiffened, eyes darting between them. Emily's face was calm, but her words cut deep. She said, you search for truth, but you'll destroy us all. Richard whispered, family should stand with blood, not against it. Emily's eyes softened, then hardened again. She said, this is survival, not betrayal. The past crashed into the present, shattering Richard's last anchor. Truth had demanded much, but now it demanded kin. The evidence spread across the table like a crime scene, maps colliding with notebooks, files bleeding into satellite prints. Richard said, every arc we traced, every number we chased, it all points south. Eleanor adjusted her glasses, voice trembling with conviction. She said, The southern corridor isn't theory, it's destiny carved in silence. Amelia clutched her notebook, her voice breaking. She whispered, "So my father's death was already written in coordinates." Lucia, watching from the shadows, said, "Truth and tragedy share the same bed." Richard clenched his jaw, his obsession now fused with grief. He said, "If Mercer buried this, then his empire is built on the bones of the lost." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "And to uncover him, we must risk being buried too." The room hummed with rain on glass, thunder rolling as if the world itself prepared for the storm of revelation. The southern Indian Ocean emerged from the data, vast and merciless. Richard said, "The sea is no grave, it's a vault." Eleanor pointed to the handshake signals, her tone steady but grim. She said, "Each pulse is a heartbeat fading into silence." Amelia whispered, "My father is out there waiting to be found." Lucia interjected, her voice sharp, "or waiting to be forgotten if Mercer succeeds." Richard's eyes burned, his hand tracing the final arc across endless waves. He said, "This path holds more than wreckage. It holds proof." Eleanor sighed, and proof becomes a weapon when held against men like Mercer. The storm outside rattled the windows as if echoing the weight of what they had uncovered. The revelation came not from maps, but from the captain's past. Files hidden in Mercer's archives exposed fragments of Adrian Lone's last days. Richard read aloud, unscheduled training, unrecorded hours, erased logs. Eleanor's face froze. She said they framed him before he was even gone. Amelia shook her head, voice trembling. She whispered, "He was no villain. He was forced into silence." Richard's voice hardened. Mercer made him the scapegoat, an easy mask for the truth. Lucia added coldly, "When power fears exposure, it sacrifices the innocent." Richard's voice grew darker. The victim was never the passengers alone. It was the man they condemned without a voice. The truth shifted again, no longer just a mystery of a plane, but of a man erased. The confrontation was no longer avoidable. Richard said, "Mercer holds the lock, and we have the key." Eleanor's tone cut sharp. Keys open doors, but they also open traps. Amelia clutched her notebook, whispering, "I want justice, not vengeance." Lucia smirked, her words sharp as glass. She said, "Justice is only vengeance with a mask." Richard paced the storm outside, howling louder than their voices. He said, "If Mercer fears the truth, then I'll place it in front of the world." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice steady. She said, "And when he strikes back, will you survive it?" Silence fell, broken only by thunder's roar. In that silence, Richard knew the path ahead would cost everything. The final pieces aligned like a blade aimed at Mercer's empire. Richard whispered, "Every silence, every missing line, every erased log, it's him." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She said, "Expose him and you bring fire." Amelia's voice cracked, "My father deserves light, even if it burns us." Lucia's tone was cold but approving. She said, "Then let the fire rise." Richard slammed the notebook shut, his voice thunder. "We confront Mercer not as seekers but as accusers." Eleanor exhaled, resignation in her gaze. She said, "Then prepare, because once truth is spoken, there is no return." Outside, the storm reached its climax, winds howling like the ghosts of the lost, as if the ocean itself demanded its story be told. The storm subsided into uneasy silence as Richard stood at the threshold of revelation. He said, "Mercer cannot hide behind curtains forever." Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she replied, "He's more dangerous in the light than in the shadows." Amelia trembled, her voice fragile but steady. She whispered, "My father deserves to be heard, even if the truth destroys us." Lucia leaned against the wall, her tone sharp. She said, "Truth never destroys. It exposes what was already rotting." Richard clenched the notebook tighter, his voice breaking through the tension. He said, "We will confront him, not for power, not for glory, but for the dead who cannot speak." The words lingered like a vow carved into stone, a promise heavy enough to alter lives. The confrontation unfolded in Mercer's private office, walls lined with polished oak and hidden screens. Richard said, "You orchestrated silence and called it investigation." Mercer smirked, calm and deliberate. He said, "History is written by those who survive, not by those who disappear." Eleanor's tone cut sharp as glass. She said, "You turned victims into scapegoats and lies into policy." Amelia's voice cracked. "My father's death was not a footnote." Mercer's eyes flickered with irritation before settling back into calm. He said, "The world needs stability, not your chaos." Richard's voice thundered, "The world needs truth, no matter how it trembles." The room held its breath as ideology clashed against obsession, and silence loomed heavier than words. Richard pushed forward, slamming the notebook onto Mercer's desk. He said, "Every erased log, every hidden note, every broken family, they all led back to you." Mercer leaned back, hands clasped, eyes sharp. He said, "Truth is a weapon, but you are too fragile to wield it." Eleanor's voice cut cold, "Then let it wound you first." Amelia whispered through tears, "The dead deserve more than silence." Mercer's smile faltered, a crack in his armor of control. Richard said, "You underestimated us, and now the shadows you built collapse in the light." The air thickened with the weight of revelation, the moment balanced between victory and ruin. Mercer's facade cracked, but his arrogance remained. He said, "You think truth frees you, but it shackles nations." Richard's voice rose, "Then let nations bear the weight, not the victims." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice steady. She said, "Control built on lies collapses in the end." Amelia whispered, "The families deserve peace." Mercer's eyes hardened, his calm slipping into desperation. He said, "Expose me, and the chaos will consume you first." Richard's tone was final, his words a hammer. He said, "Better chaos than silence." The silence afterward was suffocating, as if the entire world listened through the cracks of that office. The truth finally reached the world, leaking through screens, reports and whispers turned into headlines. Richard said, "The silence is broken, but the cost is endless." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes weary. She said, "We gave them answers, but lost ourselves in the process." Amelia whispered, "Peace does not erase grief, but it gives it meaning." Lucia's voice lingered like smoke. "Truth never heals. It scars." Richard stood by the window, storm clouds parting to reveal the fragile dawn. He said, "We uncovered the truth, but it will haunt us more than the lies ever did." The morning light carried both victory and sorrow, and in its glow, they stood as survivors of a truth too heavy to hold.